Welcome, everyone. My name's Adam, and I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Piers Turner to discuss John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill's On Liberty, the 1851 pamphlet. And before we get started, what I was going to do is assume that for the most part, you have no background knowledge of the pamphlet. So this is just kind of an overview, and I take our job to be convincing you that it's worth reading. So that'll Piers, that'll be our job for today. Make a sales pitch for reading it. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to be running a chapter by chapter reading group using this new edition from Hackett. It's just coming out, so um, I think the release date for Amazon is Tuesday the 31st, but our reading group will start on April 19th, Sunday at the same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And then we'll go through each chapter every consecutive Sunday. And Piers will be joining us for 3 of those 5 weeks, and then I'll be leading 2 of the weeks. And I think chapter two, we're going to start a couple of hours later. So all of the scheduling details you can find on Interintellect on the website. But with that, to start, we'll just, if you could just introduce yourself, say where you're calling from, what your interest is in the book, if you've read it before, if you have any familiarity with John Stuart Mill, and then we'll go from there. So Piers can go last, and I'll just call on people. I'll leave Karen off since she needs to be mute. So Max, could you please start?
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone, Max Campagna. I am calling in from Phoenix, Arizona. Um, my I haven't read Mills. I read a little bit of his autobiography, which is quite fascinating. I feel like he was a very smart individual by the time he was an adult. It was I don't know. Recently, I was listening a little bit of the audiobook of it, and it's crazy all of the various things that he wrote and read when he was just like a teenager. It's pretty remarkable. But I've heard great things on Mill, and I just am really looking forward to really diving into this book. I've always had it on the bookshelf, and it's always been staring at me, but I've never had the chutzpah to actually go in and dive in. So I'm really excited to do that without you all. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Ines?
Hi there, I am joining from Barcelona, Spain, and I have read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty when I was very young, like 18, and
Mhm.
most of it I think just went over my head. And
Mhm.
some of it, I think what I remember, I resonated deeply. His view on free speech, the tyranny of the majority, and then even some of the most problematic aspects of the text, such as the little well, the paternalism that he allows for certain people, I found greatly appealing, or at least persuasive. And since I have come in contact with ideas that are in the book, or from the book, or perhaps were articulated there, or from the pamphlet rather, and I have trouble with a lot of them, including the ones that resonated with me when I was 18, as is usually
Mhm.
the case. Thankfully, I've made some progress, or perhaps involution, or I don't know. And my main desire in joining this event and the reading group is in seeing what sort of what we can make of um, of Mill's take on liberty.
Mhm.
What basically, if the baby can be rescued and the bathwater turned out by us. I know that it has been tackled, this issue of what can be rescued from On Liberty and Mill more broadly or comprehensively, and I would like to partake in that exercise with you guys.
Okay, thank you. John?
Yes, hello. I am calling from San Francisco. I've never read On Liberty. I do have a quirk where I enjoy reading and talking about old books. I went to St. John's
Yeah.
College uh, and picked up a habit of doing that, which I really get that itch scratched by intellect. I've heard a lot of good things about Mill. I guess I've heard a lot of good things about both Mills.
Mhm.
I'm updating to remember that. And uh, uh, and so yeah, I'm just looking forward to this.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm sure you've heard of the Catherine Project, John.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I participate there. It's like inter intellect, but it's based out of St. John's College, and it's a great books reading group.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's yeah, they're accepting applications for their summer seminar right now. If you want to check, if any of you want to check it out, the Catherine Project. Okay. Kat, could you please just say a few words about to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kat. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I bought the book many years ago and didn't read it. It's been on my bookshelf. So when I saw this, I just thought, yes. So just interested in what he talks about. So freedom and liberty and um, I guess where there needs to be boundaries around that or not. I'm just curious to learn more. So um, and I'm going to buy the new edition coming out too for the group. I'm hopefully planning on coming to most of the book club. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And Karen, we'll skip over you since you said you need to stay off camera. If you ever want to enter any questions into the chat, just feel free to. I'll keep my eye on that. Zombor, would you mind
Hi,
just in? I
hi, I'm Shombar. I'm calling from New York. I've read fragments from On Liberty. I've definitely heard about most of the ideas listed, here also in the invite, but I never really had a close read of it, and I'm excited to learn more about the entire topic and what you all think about it too.
Okay, thank you. And Piers, he's the guest of honor. He's associate professor of philosophy at The Ohio State University. And maybe could you start by saying just a few words about how long your research has focused on the Mills or John Stuart Mill in particular?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say thank you, Adam, for organizing this. Thank you, all of you, for being here. It's for me. I just always enjoy talking about John Stuart Mill and or on Liberty. And so this is a great opportunity for me. And obviously, we have this new edition of the book that just came out, and so it's a even more. It's a nice opportunity to be able to talk with people about what we're doing that might be different in that volume. Um, so I'll just say, so I'm calling from Columbus, Ohio, which is where Ohio State University is, and I've been a Mill scholar basically for my entire career. I've written on a few other things, but that's been the majority of my work. Um, and so I don't know. I've been at Ohio State for 16 years now. So to answer that kind of question, and I don't know. I don't know if you want me to say a few words about the volume, Adam, or where we should go from here.
Well, I guess we'll come to the volume in a second. What I was going to do is spend maybe 20 minutes just posing some questions to peers to introduce the main themes of the book and also what is special about this new volume. And we have one person. Um, okay, Besma, welcome. We just finished with introductions, and if you'd like, would you be willing to just say a few words about where you're calling from and what, if any, kind of background you have with John Stewart with the Millses on Liberty?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Besma. I'm calling from Saudi Arabia. I studied economics for my undergrad, so we read a lot of John Stuart Mill, and that's about it. I haven't read him since, but I am interested in like political theory, economic theory, that kind of stuff.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. And before I forget, for anyone who hasn't purchased the new edition that we'll be using for the reading group, you can use this coupon code for 20% off if you order it from Hackett Publishing, and it also applies to a new volume edited by Greg Conti, who's a political theorist at Princeton, on John Stuart Mill's writings on representative government. If you'd like to, you don't need to get this new edition for our reading group. The text is standardized in English, but it would be helpful. It would be nice, but not required, for us to all have the same pagination and the bonus material that Piers will talk about in a little while. Okay, so just to introduce myself, I'm a political philosopher. I've been teaching a few semesters at California State University, Fullerton, a political philosophy course, and the most enjoyable text I've had to read with students has been on liberty, and I've found it just much easier than more recent writings to connect to what students are interested in, much easier to get them excited about it, despite the fact that it was published in 1859 by this stodgy Victorian. A lot of the ideas continue to remain fresh and relevant and challenging. So I think to start, and then first we'll introduce the main theses of the book and then go into the particulars of the volume that Piers edited. Piers, could you say a bit about why you think the work is of continued relevance, not just to philosophers, but to citizens struggling with issues about free speech or respect for diversity?
Yeah, so the work was written for the public, not just for academic philosophers. So let me just say in advance, though, I am an academic philosopher, which means that there's a chance I'll get caught up in minutia that don't interest you. So feel free to always push me back to sort of more big picture type questions about the value of this book. But I think this book is the most important book in the liberal democratic tradition still. And I think the reason that's the case is it, more than any other book, even though it's so short and written for the public, sets out a kind of a framework for what it is to live in a progressive, open society where people disagree about right and wrong, right? They disagree about how they think they should live. And so it sets out kind of terms of association, politically and socially, that sort of allow people to live in their own different ways, but on and then tries to articulate what the principles are that should be sort of a limiting government or social intrusion in people's lives. Um, Now, the Mills make clear at the beginning there have to be some rules that are enforced for us all to live together. There has to be coordination. So the idea is not that like people can just do whatever they want, but we need to have some kinds of principles that protect people. And let me just say specifically, what they're coming from is this idea that just having a democracy doesn't solve the problem. So obviously the main thing that they were pushing back against was the aristocracy of the time in England. And they didn't want to have a monarchy either. But there were some theorists who thought, like, well, look, if we just have democracy, then everything's going to be fine. But then, Alexis de Tocqueville talked about the tyranny of the majority famously. And the Mills took that up and said, yeah, look, even in a democracy, we need to have some protection against sovereign power. We need to have so that people can sort of have rights, basically, and live in their own way to some extent. But we need to sort of talk about why and what that means. And so I think the Mills end up laying out sort of four main things that people have carried with them. So one is just the importance for progress of social experimentation, that the way we make progress is by learning from each other, doing things in different ways, and that nobody has all the answers, right? And so that's really important. We all have something to learn from others. The second point is related is that actually the kind of individuality that you can express by having room for social experimentation is also valuable to each of us in our own way. So it's important to be our own person where we're not just following along with other people. Now, of course, some people just are more conforming in their mindset. It's not that everybody has to be some original genius in every aspect of their lives, but the idea that there's some ability for each of us to think through our own lives and develop for ourselves is just a valuable part of one's own flourishing or well-being. The third part is they introduce a specific principle called the harm principle or the liberty principle sometimes that says specifically government or social authority, like a church, like a dominant church, shouldn't interfere in people's lives except where there's risk of non-consensual harm to others. And I think we're probably going to talk a little bit about this. But the idea is that, like, if what I'm doing is only affecting me, then government or social authority shouldn't interfere with me. Or if Max and I are doing something together and we've both consented to it, and we know there are risks in that, then government or social authority still shouldn't interfere with us because we both know what we're doing and we've taken it up, and it's basically a kind of a private matter that relates just to each of us. It's only when what we're doing risks harm to some third party who's not consenting that then society maybe should be able to say, okay, maybe this is something we should consider regulating. But even then, it's possible that regulation would be bad, and we could talk about that. It's just that society would have the right to consider interfering. And then, so then you might also want to say though, like, so, but but doesn't everything potentially harm other people? And I'm sure we're going to talk about this more with Adam also. But I think that the key thing is to appreciate the kind of government shouldn't be interfering with you for your own good. That's for you to decide, or for Max and me to decide if we're doing something together jointly. And that's actually a very powerful principle in and of itself. And we can talk about why. The fourth thing I just want to mention is a very strong free speech chapter. And we can talk about the specifics of that too, but they specifically want to defend the idea that public discussion, and discussion is an important word, should not be regulated or coerced. So that any kind of viewpoint in sort of free, fair, sincere public discussion should be allowed to be introduced. And so that's all in this chapter 2, and it ends up being this very important statement. And let me just finish the thought, which is to say, if you take all of that on board, you get a bit of a basic blueprint for what a liberal society might need to look like. And it's one that has appealed to people on different ends of kind of the liberal spectrum. So you might think in the United States, we talk about liberal as being on the left. But what we're here talking about is the liberal tradition as being something that lots of people adhere to, people who are more conservative, but who believe in liberal rights, people who are more progressive, but they believe in liberal rights, right? They're all part of the liberal tradition. And what the Mills are trying to lay out is kind of some basics of what the liberal tradition looks like.
And for the liberal tradition, what does the word liberal add to democracy? So liberalism is the tradition that emphasizes individual liberty, and it spans both the contemporary left and the right. Could you say a little bit more about what it means to add liberal to liberal democracy?
Yeah, I think at least for the Mills and maybe some others writing who are sort of in the same vein as them, democracy is viewed really more as like a set of mechanisms or kind of the public check on power kind of mechanism of democracy. It's just sort of a how are we going to organize our government kind of question, and who has sovereign power. Whereas the liberal part is talking more about kind of a little more broadly about what are the social circumstances within which we're living together. So like what's the context within which we're going to have a democratic government. So more specifically, so for the Mills, or for John Stuart Mill anyway, he talked about form of government as one kind of question, and he talked about kind of a degree of he calls centralization, but just think of it as degree of liberty as a sort of separate question. And so you might say, and so what you could be thinking about it also as the difference between kind of what it is to have a progressive sort of open society. That's kind of the liberal part. We need to have these conditions in place for people to be able to learn from each other and grow and all the rest. But within that, it might make sense to have a democratic form of government that's just a good way of making decisions. And I think that's kind of how the Mills were thinking of the difference.
Okay. So a lot of canonical works in the liberal tradition prior to the 19th century deal with the problem of constraints on power to protect against state tyranny. And with On Liberty, it's partly about that, but it also is about pressures of social conformism and the forms of tyranny individuals can exercise over each other. And I was wondering, could you just speak to this a little bit, and then we'll transition into the discussion of co-authorship because it brings up Mill's relationship with his wife, but just the role of how the book addresses not just political tyranny, but also forms of social tyranny that comes from a drive towards enforcing conformism.
Yeah, I mean that's 100% right. And so sometimes though people will emphasize, they'll say, look, On Liberty is a book that's not really about, say, government interference. It's more about social interference. And I would just emphasize it's actually about both. It's just
Yeah.
they emphasize the social interference because people have talked about government interference more. And then I think there's actually a very kind of strict parallel. It's just that government interference tends to use formal mechanisms for interference. So policy, law, punishment, those kinds of things. Whereas social authority tends to use basically like public opinion, those kinds of pressures, social pressures to keep people sort of conforming or in line in one way or another. But then there's still this kind of parallel between them, and the Mills just want to emphasize that we need to sort of recognize that coercion, the real issue is coercion, whether it's legal means or social public opinion means. The question is, when is coercion justified by either one of them? And they want to say, like, so we've got to talk about both of those cases.
And the arguments are, at least to some extent, informed by the Mills's experience of social pressures against their relationship. So I guess here we can transition to that in the question of co-authorship. Just by way of introduction, could you talk about how the two, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, how they met, why their relationship was unconventional, and then we'll transition from that into the evidence for treating Harriet Taylor Mill as the co-author.
Sure. So you're right that I do think their personal experience did inform some of these views. I mean, j- uh, just to jump ahead a little bit to say, they were both concerned with women's rights, and John Stuart Mill especially was not a religious believer, and so in both those ways, he felt that the church in and but also prevailing social norms around the roles of men and women, he could see that there was, the forces of conformity were in place, even if they weren't always being enforced by the government itself through legal means. And so, but just to then pick up, so they met in about 1830. They were both in their young 20s. Harriet Taylor Mill, at the time, Harriet Taylor, she had married a man named John Taylor. She was pregnant with her third child at the time. And John Stuart Mill was a young kind of hotshot writer, the son of another sort of hotshot writer named James Mill. And they were both, who was a student of Jeremy Bentham, the famous legal scholar and philosopher. And they met at kind of a reading group at a party at a friend's of a friend's kind of house. Harriet had been part of a kind of a free thinking group. And John Stuart Mill was starting to write essays publicly about liberal reforms, basically, and utilitarianism, the moral philosophy that he adhered to. But they pretty quickly they were impressed by each other. But she was married. So for the next 20 years, this was, I mean, I won't go into all the details, but it was awkward. It was complicated. Apparently, I don't think well, divorce was not a real possibility for Harriet. And so she worked out an arrangement with her first husband where she ended up living somewhat separately. And John Stuart Mill would come visit her. This was considered scandalous by some of their friends. And so they definitely, to some extent, kept their relationship private for about 2 decades until the first husband actually died, John Taylor. He was a very respectable person. Actually, both John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill really respected him. But she wasn't as in love with him. And so when he died in 1849, then the Mills were able to marry in 1851. They had 7 wonderful years together, and then she died in 1858. And then actually he lived until 1873, and many of the works that we associate with him actually came after the period with Harriet Taylor Mill. But the main work of their time together during their marriage was this book on liberty. And in fact, she died just before its publication. They weren't necessarily going to publish it right then, but when she died, Mill decided not to change it anymore. And so then he just submitted it to the publisher and it was published within a couple months.
And it was published under his own name. But what is the case for co-authorship?
Well, the case for co-authorship is it has multiple strands. For many years, there are people who've been interested in Harriet Taylor Mill's work, especially, but also some John Stuart Mill scholars who've sort of acknowledged that she basically probably should be considered as a co-author. But no one had really mounted the case completely and felt confident enough, I think, to do it. This new volume, partly the reason we felt confident to do it, finally, is that we did bring together a team of people. You'll notice there's 6 editors, and it's partly because there are 2 of the leading Harriet Taylor Mill scholars in the world are on it, multiple John Stuart Mill scholars, and it includes a number of people who've been doing some work on stylometric textual analysis, which is a bit of evidence that I'm going to mention in a second, who were also part of the team. And so the idea is we felt confident enough to really go forward with it. And it was a long project, and we challenged each other along the way, asking ourselves many times whether we really believed what we were saying, and we all felt very confident about it. So here's the case comes actually a lot from Mill's own testimony originally. He says, not just in the preface to On Liberty, but in his autobiography, that the work belonged sort of as much to her as to him, and that there was a conjunction of their minds. And you might think, oh, well, sometimes he says this kind of more broadly about a bunch of his work from that time. But what he also lays out in the autobiography is more specifics about the process. And so in particular, it wasn't just that they had some common ideas, the sort of common fund of ideas. It wasn't just that they had sort of conceived this book together. It wasn't just that they'd been talking about these things together. He also talks that said they had for a long time been pulling out this book together and going over every word together. And so that there's this, you can picture an actual sort of drafting process where the 2 of them were actually working on this text together. And then there's some evidence from friends, in particular this Alexander Bain, who was one of Mill's closest friends and who was skeptical of Harriet in some ways, but even he acknowledges that she bore a considerable part in this volume, and that it might be hard to even separate out which parts are his and which parts are hers. So there's kind of, first of all, there's this testimonial evidence. But I think people hadn't felt confident enough on that basis to still put her name on the cover. So I'll just say what I think really opened the door to doing this was this recent stylometric analysis of the text, which is still uncertain and imperfect, but it basically is a process where you can, a computer can identify a style of an author. So if we took everything you've ever written and we put it into this computer, there's going to be certain patterns in the way that you write, the way that you use certain words, not just big fancy words, but even how you use smaller words like the and it can sort of develop a kind of a sense of what your stylome is, it's called. And the core claim here is just that the stylome in On Liberty changes. So there isn't as much writing from Harriet to feel as confident about what her stylome is. She just didn't write as much as John Stuart Mill did. But there is some evidence, at least for parts of the text, that her stylome seems to appear in limited ways in certain places in the text, especially chapter 3 on individuality. And what we took this to be, and we could talk more about that, but we took this to be a basic kind of corroboration of Mill's own claims. So if there had been kind of skepticism that maybe Mill had just been sort of saying, overpraising his deceased wife, now it looked like actually, if you look at the stylometric evidence, it's clear there's another hand. There's another person seems to have been involved in writing or drafting at least parts of the text. And so then we just thought, well, what are the standards of co-authorship today? Right? We all know that when there are co-authored texts, certainly in the sciences, not everybody has done exactly the same things for the production of a text. Right? There's always a first author, second author, third author, fourth author, right? So we understand there's different ways that people can contribute to a text. And so the core question for us just was, had she, on the basis of this, done enough to justify co-authorship? And we left it open whether you want to consider her a full co-equal author. We weren't trying to answer every question with specificity, but we just wanted to say, had she passed the threshold for co-authorship? And to us, it's clear if you take this common fund of ideas that they'd been talking these things through, that they'd conceived of the book together, that they'd been going over every part of the text together, and then there's even evidence that actually it wasn't just John Stuart Mill's stylome. It just seems that the case is clear that she should be considered a co-author, leaving some further questions for the future for other people. Oh, I'll say one more bit of evidence is just, and it's in our volume, is we provide a lot of supplementary materials from their other writings, and including some other writings that were unpublished by Harriet Taylor Mill that just show her engaging with some of the same issues of On Liberty earlier on. John Stuart Mill was also writing essays where he's engaging with these issues earlier on, but so is she. And so it just gives you some confidence to say that she was a thinker in her own right, and it makes sense that she would have been having interesting, detailed philosophical conversations with John Stuart Mill in a way that supports, again, the general case.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I was going to ask you about the supplementary material, but I guess you've just covered that. At this point, I'm going to take a step back, and if anyone has questions they'd like to ask Piers about the book, so the book is obviously argumentatively dense, and it would take probably more than 5 sessions to go through it carefully. So we can go keep the conversation at any level of generality you like. While Piers was talking, I pasted into the chat what I think is the canonical formulation of the harm principle. But the book, there's the harm principle, there's the defense of free speech, there's the defense of diversity and experiments in living, and then the fourth, well, what am I leaving out, Piers?
Just individuality, maybe.
Okay, yeah. So we can just talk about any of those or the question of co-authorship and just go in whatever direction you'd like. So feel free to jump in, and also if you raise your hand, I'll keep track of a queue. Ines?
Thank you. I have a first question on something you said, and I think that you gave away the answer later, but I really don't understand. It's not self-justifying enough for me. So you said that that democracy, according to the Mills, was supposed to solve a problem. And then you mentioned their emphasis on the problem of coercion. Why is coercion a problem? And if that's not the issue that democracy is meant to solve for, what is the issue or the problem, rather?
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear. The claim is that there are other authors who thought if you once you've established democracy, you've kind of done what you need to do as a matter of having a sort of a just society. So you might think of someone like Rousseau, who thought like if we can have a kind of a process where we're sort of fully instantiating sort of democratic principles, then uh, then that's sort of all that's the end of the story in terms of what we're trying to think about when we want to have a just society. And for the Mills, they thought, well, even on a picture like Rousseau's, though, you could have a tyranny of the majority. Right. And so and so the problem of coercion, I guess, in that sense, is that there could be a majority of people in a democracy who are able to impose their views on everyone else, even pretty significant minorities of people. And the now coercion is necessary sometimes to you have to maintain coordination. You need to enforce some rules so we can all have a society together. It's not that coercion is always wrong or bad. But it's the worry is that there could be unjustified coercion, even by a democratic authority. And so what we need to do, the question they were trying to ask is how can we sort of articulate the principles that should limit any kind of authority, a democratic authority, a social authority, like what are their general principles that should be limiting the use of coercion in society? And that, I mean, I'll just say, just to come back to the very beginning, I find all of this quite inspiring because I think there are principles here that people appeal to when their side is on the side is a minority, and then they conveniently forget about when their side is doing better. And you just see this all the time, I think, in US or something, or I have colleagues at the university who talk a lot about freedom of speech as being so important or academic freedom when they feel like their views are the ones that are being challenged or silenced, but then they turn around and when someone else wants to express a view that is not the view that they favor, they think, oh, that view shouldn't be expressed at all, that we shouldn't have that view on campus. Do and so I think part of what the Mills are trying to do is just trying to say actually these are principles we need to defend, um, regardless of whether your view is the one that's sort of doing better or worse in society at a given time. And I think that's why it's so hard and why we need a book like this to keep reminding us of that.
Thank you. Could I ask to clarify whether the ultimate then underlying issue is that of creating or instantiating a just society, if that is the ultimate end?
I think that's one way of putting it. I mean, they were I would maybe want to ask you, I don't want to what you mean by justice or what you mean by that. But I think just think of it as of a well-organized society. Like if we were going to have the best social and political arrangements, what would they be? And for them, the idea is we don't know everything we need to know about that at any given time. So we need to make sure that whatever else we decide, which could be justified democratically or in other ways, we need to always make sure that we keep in place those conditions that allow us to continue to talk about things, freedom of speech, try out different ideas, social experimentation, right? What they call experiments of living, um, right? So that we can continue to learn from each other and make progress. And then they want to say, and if you think that we've reached the point where we know everything we need to know, you're essentially saying there is no more progress to be made. And then you're essentially saying then like I know more now than all future decision makers might know. And they think that's just a completely unacceptable move to claim that we know now more than anybody would know in the future. And so we need to make sure that we maintain the conditions that are open for learning and progress. So, sorry, there's a little bit of roundabout answers to say like what they're immediately focused on is kind of progress because they don't think we're ever in a position to say, here is justice, we've got it. But the only way to make progress towards justice is to just keep open the conditions that allow for progress. Do you see what I'm saying? And along the way, different rules might be justified because we do need to have coordination. But the rules become unacceptable to them when the rules undermine the progress conditions. So if they undermine freedom of speech or if they undermine social experimentation, then we've got a problem. And it becomes sort of unacceptable.
Kat,
Thank you.
oh, you're
Yeah,
you're muted.
sorry.
Yeah.
This might be like a completely inappropriate question to jump into right now. So just say pass
Oh,
if
go
you
ahead.
want to answer
Doesn't
it.
matter.
But how do you think the Mills would view the current political situation with the Trump administration right now? And I don't want to just also say the Trump administration, but I'd like to get your take on even prior administrations. Would they say it's just a continuation of one of the same? Also with the social aspect of it and kind of the social pieces right now. I know this is a potentially a very personal question as well, but I'm just curious. So
No, I mean, I'm very happy to say I think they would find a lot of what's going on very problematic, and I think they would find, and so the real, but they would find a lot of what's happening by partisans. I mean, here's the thing: certain kinds of partisans, especially dogmatic-minded partisans, right? That's the enemy to some extent. So the people who think that they know enough to impose their views on others. So I think you can find people on the left and the right who are like that, and the Mills would be critical of them. I do think in our political moment right now, the biggest threat to this kind of progressive open society is coming from the right. It's coming from a party that has embraced certain ideas of a certain kind of confidence, a certain kind of dogmatic thinking that is, whatever, some of it's nationalistic, some of it's, I mean, I don't know what you want to call it, but that the threat to sort of freedom of speech is coming more from the right. But as soon as I say that, I just want to be clear, like, of course, there are also lots of cases we can point to where people on the left are sort of also not willing to listen to people on the other side, or it's just that I don't think that's the primary threat right now.
how did we end up in this place, I guess? Is it because people aren't reading Mills and, everyone isn't doing the reading they should be doing? I know that's a really big question. I'm just going to ask your opinion and then I'll let the next person go.
I don't know. I'm not a historian. I will say that I do think living in a pluralistic society where you embrace the pluralism at the same time that you have your own views is hard, right? So Karl Popper, who is this other liberal philosopher who came later in the mid 20th century, he has this phrase called the strain of civilization. It's not a great phrase, but all he means by that is the strain of living in an open society. And so here I am, like maybe I have my own religious views or my own particular moral views or my own thoughts about how we should organize ourselves. Maybe I'm a progressive, maybe I'm a conservative of some sort, right? But at the same time, what liberalism of the million sort is asking me to do is to like celebrate and embrace this kind of progressivism, this kind of experimentalism, this that I'm valuing your ability to be an individual in your way, even at the same time that I'm an individual in my way. And there's always going to be a bit of a tension. And so in Popper's mind, also that there's going to be because it's hard to live in a society like that, there's always going to be a tendency for us to kind of withdraw back to our tribes, right? We're going to want to go talk to the people who agree with us. And a lot of that's just natural, of course, right? If I go to church on Sunday with other people who have the same beliefs that I do, it's very reinforcing. It's community building. And if everyone else is doing things in their own way, then there's just this tendency to sort of say like, oh, well, this is much more comfortable. And then you can just view politics as a kind of a battle where the idea is to like, well, whose views are kind of win out about what rules should be in place. But I think this core liberal tradition coming from John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill and On Liberty is trying to say like, actually, we need a whole new tradition. So whatever your religious views or whatever your moral views or whatever those are, can you also just embrace the experimentalism itself? Can you also just embrace the individuality itself as a valuable thing? And we should all be able to sort of embrace those things, and we need to if we're also going to sort of remain committed to the idea of like continuing to improve our social arrangements. And again, so this is not just a philosopher's answer, but I just think it's hard. And so the tendencies are always in the other direction.
Max?
Thank you. I think this is on the same vein, and maybe Piers, you've already kind of talked about it. If there's any other things you can say about it, but it seems like the Mills on liberty is a lot on the individual itself, the individualism aspect of it. But what do they have to say about the social cohesion of it? This probably goes towards Kat's question about current the current aspect of society, but just in general, like, is it in On Liberty or in other publications that they've worked on? Just I can understand the individual aspect of it, but just that aspect of social cohesion. Is it about, you mentioned tribes. It seems like Mill wasn't a religious individual and very individual in that aspect. So does he talk more about that, or his wife?
Yeah. So Mill in particular does. So I mean, if the big picture idea here is trying to create a bit of social cohesion around the idea of living in liberal society itself. Okay, there are challenges with that, but I also take what you're saying is like there's a lot of focus on kind of individuality and individualism, and so does he talk about community at all? And so there's a couple things to say here. The first is just to answer directly the John Stuart Mill was also a utilitarian, so this is a moral philosophy that says it holds the greatest happiness principle. So it says that what we should be doing, what makes things right or wrong ultimately, and on his personal view, although again, as a liberal, he's open to people having different views. But on his personal view, his idea is that the impartial promotion of everyone's well-being is what makes actions right or wrong, where well-being has to do with happiness and the avoidance of suffering. So we're trying to make everyone happy. We're trying to avoid suffering because we're trying to promote everyone's well-being impartially. For him, what that really at the end of the day would amount to, though, is a society where each of us identifies our own well-being with everyone else's well-being. So actually, in his own work, he has a very robust idea of sort of the sociality, the socialness, the fellow feeling that he imagines in his other book called Utilitarianism. He imagines this kind of identification where Max, I wouldn't be happy if you're not happy. And he thinks and I identify my happiness with your happiness, and you identify your happiness with my happiness to some extent, that actually tends in a very egalitarian direction for Mill in his own work. So on liberty, it's always important to remember it's just one part of a broader project that is Mill's project. But it gets removed from Mill's own broader project a lot because people just think as a standalone text for liberalism, it's kind of valuable. And so the second thing I wanted to say is that Mill, when he died, what he was most famous for was being a radical egalitarian reformer. So he had spent a lifetime getting criticized and ridiculed very publicly with death threats for promoting women's rights, for he resisting the rise of scientific racism, for promoting workers' rights, for he was one of the main voices making sure that England stayed on the side of the North in the American Civil War against the slavery South. So he spent a whole lifetime being this egalitarian reformer, and that was his main public persona. Um, and he got ridiculed for it. And so he really wanted to create a kind of social conditions of social equality. So he thought a lot of what progress consists in is the removal of hierarchies of various sorts, what he called the aristocracies of color, race, and sex. Okay, things like we needed to be trying to remove those hierarchies. So at the end of the day, he does have a picture that's a very kind of what the justice is that he's imagining in some future ideal is a very egalitarian justice, and one where people identify their own well-being with other people's well-being. But I will say that's not in On Liberty very clearly, that picture. But one of the points we try to make even in our introduction is that it's important to see on liberty as part of a broader egalitarian reform project. And one more point on this is just to say, liberty and equality, they sound like they're different values. But again, if you think about women's rights as being just below the surface of this book with Harriet Taylor Mill's involvement, right? I mean, women's equality just is a liberty issue, right? So when you talk about the importance of individuality, and you think about England, women's inequality meant that they are not able to express their own individuality, right? So the equality point just is a freedom point, just is an individuality point also.
Ines?
Please, could you say more on his engagement with scientific racism or like the science of group differences? I'm fascinated. I haven't heard at all about this side to his intellectual trajectory. And,
Yeah.
and if you could please say more also about his engagement with science as an enterprise, as an ancillary to that point.
Well, so just on that second point, he wrote a book called A System of Logic, which is part of what it does is it lays out for the 19th century, and it became the leading text for the 19th century on kind of think of it as philosophy of social sciences, and it has a lot of scientific method type stuff in it about how to do good testing. He had views about inductive logic and things like that, and so he had that was a big part of his reputation as a philosophical thinker, was on the basis of this basically textbook System of Logic, and also he wrote a whole text on political economy as well, where he was sort of an inheritor of that tradition. But to come back to your point about the racism point, it's an interesting thing. So I'll just say, as a Mill scholar, I often encounter people who the main thing they know about John Stuart Mill is that he was, in his day job, he worked for the East India Company, which was, at the time that he was working for the East India Company, was no longer supposed to be a for-profit organization, but it had essentially become a kind of civil service wing of the British government that was ruling India. And he had a civil service role, and he started off kind of preparing dispatches from the governors of the East India Company to India. And by the end of his career, for the last 2 years, from 1856 to 1858, so this is while Harriet was still alive, he became the chief examiner, it was called. So he was the head of this office that was sending dispatches from one side to the other. And actually, he had a real role to play then in even what the content of these dispatches was. So, look, I mean, that looks very bad. So you think like, well, why? So he was willing to work for basically a colonial enterprise, and I would just want to say, hopefully not too defensively, but I think that it's true that he worked for the East India Company, but I think there's a lot else to say about John Stuart Mill besides that point. And for instance, within the East India Company, he advocated a lot for the rights of Indians. And he resisted some of the sort of worst impulses within the company in some of those debates. He also thought it was a temporary measure. He really resisted the idea that the English would just rule India. He said publicly that no, I mean the whole idea here is to train the Indians so that they can then come to rule themselves. He also rejected some of the worst impulses of colonialism, like he didn't think it was justified for racist reasons. He didn't think it was justified for like religious reasons of evangelism. He didn't think it was justified on economic exploitation grounds. He really just his view, to the extent that he supported colonialism, it was entirely on a paternalistic basis, which is bad enough, but he's basically was just saying it was for the benefit of the Indians. And if the English were not able to do it for the benefit of the Indians, then there was a real problem. But he believed that there was a way for some countries, all countries had been sort of savage at one point or another. He thought all countries, but some countries, he believed, had luckily made advances in understanding certain kinds of legal things, educational things, in advance of some other countries, and could now help other countries get to where they were trying to go. It's completely paternalistic. We reject it now. but he was not the worst. Like I don't think he should be associated with the worst aspects of the sort of the colonialism. Moreover, I think what people never don't mention is he also evolved on this issue. And so he ended up being one of the main critics of British colonialism later in his career, starting in the 1860s. He was very critical with the way the British put down the Indian Rebellion in 1857, and in fact, that contributed to his feeling that he should not continue with the British colonial government. He was very critical of how the British were treating the Maoris in New Zealand, and he was explicit saying he didn't trust the English. He also was very critical of the way the English treated the Irish, and he also stuck his neck out on that. I mean, he was known as one of the main critics, and he also was for 3 years a member of Parliament and spent a huge amount of his political capital during those years trying to hold accountable the governor of Jamaica for atrocities against Black Jamaicans. It's called Governor Eyre. There was a Morant Bay rebellion, and this governor of Jamaica ruthlessly put down this rebellion. And John Stuart Mill was the head of the committee that tried to have Governor Eyre held accountable. And he ended up not being reelected in large part because and so, he was called an N-word lover by his opponents and things like this. And he really stuck his neck out he was on these things. Having one more thing, I'll just say in the 1850s, a little bit earlier, somebody he knew, Thomas Carlyle, another famous intellectual, had written a very racist piece called The Negro Question, I think, and John Stuart Mill wrote a response to it, trying to make clear how terrible he thought this view was. And what he basically said was, it's not that there aren't differences in the cultures around the world, and he was willing to say that he thought some were more advanced than others, okay? But he thought it was wrong to attribute that to innate biological differences. And he just thought that was people were leaping to that conclusion, and that was wrong. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Thank you. Is that the extent of his engagement with so-called scientific racism, his engagement with Carlyle's publication?
I think he made this claim also in his Principles of Political Economy, and maybe one other place where it's in multiple places that he says, but I'm not sure I have them all at my tips. But I think Principles of Political Economy is another place where he says we shouldn't be attributing this to innate differences.
Okay, thank you.
So when he formulates the harm principle in chapter 1 of On Liberty, he says that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over a member of a civilized community is to prevent harm to others. And then he goes on and qualifies this. This doesn't apply to children. It doesn't apply to the adults who need caregivers, and it doesn't apply to societies that may be just undeveloped societies. So he offers these qualifications. And what you're suggesting is that the paternalism he expresses here for less developed societies, he backs off from it over the course of the late 50s and the early 60s.
I still think that he thinks that the harm principle as a rule for society, only makes sense in a society where there's a critical mass of people who are sort of ready for liberal society. And so, we can say, look, he was wrong. Maybe he was wrong about India. Like, I mean, I think, but and he had never visited India. But the idea, I think, still holds that he thinks there's kind of this little history that societies have to go through. And again, it's all societies, right? He kind of agrees with Thomas Hobbes. You may have heard of Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, that like the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, right? It's a violent state. And he basically agrees with that. And so what he thinks is that societies, what they need to do is to get out of a state of nature is actually a despot, a kind of whether it's a military ruler, some kind of leader that is able teach the people obedience. This is not a good place to stop, but he thinks it's what's required to get out of the state of nature is some kind. And then what happens is he thinks that kind of, once people start learning obedience, they also can learn the benefits of cooperation. So through agriculture, through military endeavors, right? If you're just thinking historically, through lots of ways, people can begin to learn the value of cooperation. And then, I mean, this is oversimplifying, but he thinks then what can emerge is that people can come to appreciate the value of cooperation without needing the despot anymore. And what he's imagining is that there's a point at which there's just a critical mass of people who see the benefits of large scale cooperation and will maintain it spontaneously on their own. And that's when he thinks societies can move from kind of a more despotic state into kind of more of a liberal democratic state. And so what he's doing is he's looking around trying to figure out, I think in some of these cases, with regard to the harm principle, have those societies reached the point at which there's a critical mass of people ready for kind of spontaneous cooperation, which he calls civilization, that the harm principle is now a relevant good rule. But I think he says even in cases where like I don't know what he thought about Jamaica in this sense, for instance, but he did think like even in cases where maybe he didn't think that the society was completely ready for this, that you still had to abide by the rule of law and you had to treat people with some basic respect. And he thought that Governor Eyre, for instance, had not done that. I'm not saying he thinks Jamaica should have had the harm principle in place yet, but I do think he thinks, right, that if you're going to be paternalistic about it, the whole aim is to bring people up to the point where they're ready for self-rule.
And John? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, I was thinking about the whole paternalism, the rationale for paternalism, and maybe this is sort of a modern way of looking at it, but I wonder if there's kind of a confusion between poverty and a sort of a what might Mill might call the state of readiness for liberalism. And I'm thinking about the different trajectories of, say, Japan and South Korea, where Japan was pretty liberal after the Second World War, whereas South Korea was authoritarian until very late in the 20th century. But they both grew economically very quickly. And I guess the argument that I would say was, well, that distinction, right? That shows the fact that they both that don't, I would argue, don't confuse poverty for lack of readiness for liberalism. Maybe, I want to put this out there, maybe everyone is ready for liberalism. And it doesn't really matter. Everyone's ready for liberalism. It's orthogonal to how your country is going to develop economically, or what, and it's good for everybody. That's at least my hypothesis.
Yeah, so I'm not an economic historian. I don't know enough about like how, societies have sort of developed in those days, but I'm certainly open to that. Like I think he could, obviously just the idea that Mill was wrong about when he thought paternalism was justified in which contexts, I think very, very open to that. I think I think part of what's important is also to see that I think he would have been open to that. I mean, he was very responsive to empirical evidence. He tried to be. And so it's important to sort of think about what are the core parts of his philosophy and what are the parts that are sort of more contingent parts of his philosophy that are based on some empirical understanding of the time. And so I think if you could come to him and say, actually, Mill, you don't really understand how societies develop, or you don't really understand how economies develop, and you're not really thinking about the key structural things you need to be thinking about, or something. I think he just would have been very responsive to all of that. But at the end of the day, I think he would have held on to some of these claims he's making about what's required for further progress. So, like, I think a lot of on liberty, hopefully he would take out some of the references maybe to like barbarian societies and things like that if he understood. But I still think he would hold on to large parts of On Liberty about how we need to remain open to social experimentation and see the value of individuality and try to live together in a pluralistic way.
I guess my question is, if it's not economics, what is the rationale for, I mean, I guess I kind of get not giving liberty to children. I kind of get not giving liberty to people, individuals who need a lot of care, although I'm happy to question that as well. But uh, uh, what is the rationale for not for denying liberty to certain societies?
Yeah, it's a great so, but the answer is that it's supposed to be the same. The answer is that it's supposed to be the same thing. So for whatever reason, so he thought, for instance, he thought anybody who's sort of not right. Part of the argument of the harm principle is to say, uh, you are the best judge of your own good, right? And so because you're the best judge of your own good, society is not the best judge of your own good. You're the one who should be making decisions that pertain to your own good. Okay. So the harm principle then has exceptions in any case where you might not be the best judge of your own good. And so what are those cases? If you're a child, you might not be the best judge of your own good. If you're somebody who is severely developmentally disabled or have some kinds of developmental issues. If you're temporarily I don't know what the right term is, insane or something like that, you're not the best judge of your own good. There's lots of states you might be in where you're not the best judge of your own good. And so I think he's obviously making the claim that he thinks in some of these societies, we don't yet have enough people who are, I don't know, educated is one aspect of it, but also sort of, as I was saying earlier, spontaneously committed to the value of cooperation. Like they're not going to be making good judgments, partly for that reason, that we should be applying this rule yet in that society.
And is that something that the Mills explain and articulate, or is that something that's kind of assumed because a reader in that time would have had the same assumptions?
They do in other writings talk about some of these claims about like who's in the best position to make judgments about their own good. They also have in a book called Considerations on Representative Government, they say more about kind of the relationship with colonies and colonial possibilities of colonial rule and things like this. So they try to, but some of this is just inference. But I think that the argument seems to be, if you take big picture, they're interested in progress and they're interested in good decision making. And so they want to have social conditions in place that are going to allow for progress. And then they want to have sort of good organization that allows for good decision making. And then the big point is they say, look, different societies are sort of in different places on that. And so what's going to be required for progress and what's going to allow for the best available decision making is just going to change. And I think a lot of that is kind of intuitive, like, yeah, okay, that's right. There could be different societies in different places and doing things in different ways that allow for, you might have different views on that stuff. But for them, yeah, it's just it ends up obviously I'm sort of lost my train a little bit, but they end up feeling uh, that some societies are not really ready for just giving them liberal democracy right away.
Just a quick question. At what age did he think children were capable of thinking in their own best good?
I don't know that he ever says it. But the principle is just, and again, that's kind of him being empirical. He's probably willing for there to be a debate about that. But the principle is just like at whatever age it seems like someone is actually in the best position to be making their own judgments about their own good, they should be the ones making those decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to return to Kat asked a while ago about free speech. Um, And if one party is better, one political party is better at respecting it than another. I wanted to ask Piers if you could just emphasize how difficult or counterintuitive the free speech principles that Mill defends are. So he argues in chapter 2 and stuff that we'll be looking at in more detail, you should not, when you're thinking about whether or not to suppress speech, you should not be guided by your intuitions of whether or not the speech is true or false. And you should not even be guided by your own sense of whether or not the speech is morally abhorrent. So, respecting these principles of free speech that he outlines in chapter 2 entails allowing people to speak their minds even when they're defending what you regard as abhorrent views, as long as they're not calling for explicit violence against a person. That's when the harm principle would kick in. So I guess I'm not formulating this as a question, more of a just a tirade, I guess. But um, so these principles of free speech would require, if you are a First Amendment lawyer, if you're someone like Greg Lukianov working at FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights, and I forget what the E is, but it's a free speech organization. It requires defending the right of Nazis to defend Nazism. It requires defending the rights of um, leftist political activists to condemn the Gaza invasion of Israel. It requires doing all sorts of work. Yeah, thank you, Foundation for Individual Rights and of Expression. It requires doing all sorts of work defending people you regard as holding wrong and deeply misguided views. And no one is entirely comfortable with that. So I just wanted to flag that the principles he articulates are really demanding, and they go counter to just a natural human inclination to feel like there are certain views we should be comfortable suppressing because they're morally abhorrent or because they're clearly false.
Yeah, so maybe I've just drunk the million wine too much, but I'm totally on board, I think, with what they're saying here. And so um, let's just say we've seen what it's like when one side thinks they know the answers. And so I think therefore it's okay for us because what you're talking about is suppression of speech, coercion, stopping speech, or the expression of other opinions. And if we really think that one side has the right, when they're in power, to stop the expression of the views that they disagree with, I think we know where that goes, where that ends up, and it ends up in some kind of more sort of, call it authoritarian kind of circumstance. And so we need even more to stand up for the rights of people to say things that we strongly disagree with, as long as they also will stand up for the right of the people they disagree with to also say the same thing. And so it's important to appreciate that, like, yeah, there is a point at which a group can become threatening to the very sort of free speech possibilities. And then we might have to do something about that. But as long as we're just talking about the expression of these opinions, and really I want to come back to the term that the Mills use, which is discussion, right? They think that we need to basically not regulate what the content is of discussion. In other writings, and part of the value of this volume that we did, this new one, is we provide a bunch of supplementary materials from other places where John Stuart Mill especially talks about freedom of speech. Not everything he wants to say about freedom of speech is in On Liberty. So there are exceptions. Again, you mentioned if you're threatening violence to someone else, but if you're potentially, there's sort of potentially treasonous acts or libelous acts, there are a range of things that are expressions of opinion that Mill allows could be regulated. But what he thinks should not be regulated is discussion. And discussion is a kind of norm-laden thing. It's the kind of thing where we're in sort of fair-minded, frank, sincere kind of dialogue with each other. And that's the core thing that they're trying to protect and say should not be regulated. They're not trying to protect threats. They're not trying to protect kinds of expression that actually might lead to harms against others in various ways. So, and there I'm just really on board personally with the idea, even though it's hard. Like, of course, there are views I strongly disagree with and find abhorrent and can't imagine would ever be part of the truth that we're actually after. But the Mills then basically try to make the case that it's always better on balance to still allow those expressions as part of discussion than it would be to coercively stop them. Now, that doesn't mean you have to stay there and listen. I mean, maybe it's good for you to stay in there and listen. And it doesn't mean you can't object to it. That's part of your speech is that you can say, I strongly disagree. I don't like this thing, right? It's not that you have to take their views as being as good as your views. Um, but I think actually coercively silencing them is it leads to problems, is my view.
So
Um,
there's one. Oh, sorry.
yes,
Go ahead.
speech. I think this is a hard question about but I do think speech can be harmful sometimes. Clearly, just epithets, offensive language can be harmful. I even think mere discussion, the way I was describing it, can be harmful if we think that it tends, say you're not doing discussion well, and it just increases polarization or sectarianism in some ways. There could be, right? We all know there are these weird effects of like just trying to argue someone into your position can sometimes drive them away even more. I don't know if that counts as harm, but I do think there can be these bad effects of even just discussion. It's so their argument is really about, though, on balance, though, if the question is about coercing, like suppressing the expression of a viewpoint, they just want to say on balance, it's all, even if there is some harm, it's better to allow it to be expressed. But again, that doesn't mean we can't in a classroom, say, for instance, where I am, encourage norms of respect, though, where we try to make sure that even though I'm not going to stop someone from expressing a viewpoint, I can still try to encourage people to express their views in ways that show respect for others.
Yeah. When we're talking about chapter 2 and 3, we'll probably focus a lot of time on what forms of speech count as harm. Mill doesn't explicitly discuss slurs or epithets, but he does give an example of riling up a crowd in front of a politician's house with the intent of getting them to commit violence.
Yeah,
Uh,
insight. Yeah.
yeah. John?
Yeah, I guess there is a lot of sort of nuance in what you were saying. Uh, and I think I heard one thing where you said something like, um, we can disagree as long as you agree, something like, we can disagree as long as you agree to defend my free speech, or something like that. And I thought, oh, I don't think that reciprocity is really necessary. Like, somebody can be against free speech as long as they don't suppress your free speech. And in fact, their argument against free speech is not going to be suppressed under a free speech regime. Only the suppression of someone else's free speech is going to be suppressed, right? Uh, I mean, maybe if you, let's say, if you go down that path and you and you harm someone else, you might end up as a prisoner and somebody who can no longer express themselves. You can't freely express yourself in a way that's going to get heard. But um, I think it's been a question, right, in the recent past, right? I remember arguments in the first Trump administration. Well, do we, in a free society, can fascists can fascists have a voice in a free society? And America seems to have gone down the path of like, yes, we let fascists have a voice. And Europe has maybe gone down more the other direction of like saying there are certain political views that are not allowed in our society. As an American, I tend towards the American way of thinking, as much as I hate fascists.
No, so that's a great correction. I agree with what you're saying, actually, and it reminds me again. I mentioned this other thinker who's very Millian on some of this stuff, named Karl Popper, who you might have heard of his thing. He's got this thing called the paradox of tolerance, and the idea is that if you tolerate the intolerant, then that could undermine tolerance. But it's important that on Popper's view is just what John is saying. Like, it's not that if someone is intolerant in their views, you should like shut them down. It's at the point that their intolerance is actually being manifested in a way that threatens the regime of tolerance, that then maybe you need to do something about it. It's not the mere holding of the view or the mere expressing of the sort of intolerant view that should be coerced. It's when you realize that these people holding this view are now getting some kind of power that actually is going to undermine tolerance altogether. And then I think as you say, the Europeans I think have made the calculation that actually this just means though you shouldn't be allowed the expression of certain kinds of viewpoints, yeah, from the get-go. So
Yeah, I don't know if you want to follow up on Karen and Jambor
you say you can see.
had some comments. I guess the the harm principle can be articulate, or the Mill's views about free speech can be articulated in different sorts of ways. So in the US context, you have the legal right to go out and wear a Nazi regalia and talk about how Hitler is great, as long as it doesn't constitute something like incitement or harassment, and as long as you obey speech and manner restrictions for public spaces. But in Germany, where they have obviously the legacy of Nazism, all of this is prohibited. So I don't know if this is getting to Jean Bor's question, but do you think the harm principle is compatible with that kind of plural pluralism of different free speech regimes depending upon context, the context specificity of the extent of freedom of speech?
If I understand the question, I think so. I mean, just from the important thing is to remember that even if the harm principle applied, let's say there's some expressive act that I'm doing or something in discussion that you find offensive or harmful in some way. Um, the harm principle just says that in principle, then society could consider interfering with that speech. But that doesn't mean society, all things considered, should interfere with that speech. And though, as I read chapter 2, I think chapter 2 is more of that kind of an on balance discussion. There is, of course, if there's, it is more about like that the goods and harms of suppressing discussion fall on the side of allowing for more discussion rather than suppressing it. And it's not exactly a direct application of just the harm principle. So that means if you could imagine the argument going, yes, sometimes discussion or speech is harmful, but on balance, we still shouldn't restrict it. And that's sort of more how I roughly think of that chapter 2. So, but that leaves open. It certainly leaves open the idea that there could be cases where, you say we got a lot of really good empirical evidence that actually suppressing some kind of speech was actually better on balance. I mean, I think Mill would have to take that seriously.
So we have a few more minutes. Is there anyone who would like to ask a final question?
I'll ask one.
Sure.
I've heard people like there's just this general concept of there, like even in democracy, but I think in free speech as well, that sown into the seeds of the concept of free speech. We're kind of talking about this right now, or even democracy is its own destruction. If you let certain powers use those certain things, certain things a certain way, right? I think a lot of that might have to do with society. I'm going to be really interested to read what they have to say about how society acts and the silent rules of society and social conformity, and how that plays into free speech and what's acceptable or what's not. For me, just like two things that really, there's so many things that can rub me the wrong way, but I would say people who are Holocaust deniers and who talk about that in free speech, and also people who deny the Sandy Hook shooting at the school. Those are two issues for me that I just, it's hard for me to get on board with free speech all the time. I want to be this big person behind free speech, but when that stuff's happening, it feels so harmful to the betterment of society to be denying actual things that in my head definitely happened and were very harmful to a lot of people. Anyway, so
not to be too cute, but the Mills would encourage you to use your voice to say exactly what you just said over and over and over and make that argument, but without actually using coercion to say that those people can't express their views. But I mean, but I hear what you're saying, that it's so serious in these cases, you wonder if there's a case to be made. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I'm like, wow, that's like, for me, that's really out there. How could you think that didn't happen? And what exactly are you up to be saying something like that? And don't you see the harm it's causing people who were affected by this? Yeah. So anyway, I'll let you comment if you have any thoughts on the seeds of free speech's own destruction is.
Well, I do think we're learning that like you have to create a tradition, or you have to create the norm. There have to be people have to buy in. The institutions don't take care of themselves. I think we're definitely seeing that.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We will stop there, and then in 3 weeks at the same time, yeah, it's at 10 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Pacific, and 1 p.m. Eastern. In 3 weeks, we'll start the reading group with chapter 1. And then if you're interested, there's no need to purchase the new edition for the purposes of the reading group. Sorry, the blurring doesn't make this possible, but there's a 20% off discount code for this new edition, Mill26, if you order it from Hackett. And thank you, Piers, and thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all.
Great meeting you all. All right, take care.
Take care. Have a good rest of your day.